How do I conceptualize white ignorance? Well, I take this concept from the political philosopher Charles W. Mills, who's written a book chapter called White Ignorance, but then also a book called The Racial Contract. And in his book, The Racial Contract, Charles Mills talks about how in Western societies, but in all white dominated societies, there's this thing called the racial contract, whether explicit or implicit, that all white people enter into in order to sustain and reproduce white supremacy. And white ignorance is a key facet of this idea of the racial contract, because what he says that white ignorance is a kind of epistemology. It's a knowledge production, and it's a power relation enacted through knowledge. And so in order to accept an idea that people of color are inferior, or in order to accept the idea of colonial plunder or exploitation or expropriation, in order for people to kind of get on with their life, they have to have frameworks for understanding the world. And those frameworks, Charles Mills argues, are based on this idea of ignorance. So an ignorance of misunderstanding the experiences of people of color, ignorance and misunderstanding, a willful and calculated misunderstanding of the racialized social order, and a misunderstanding as to why some groups are disproportionately poor and over-concentrated in low-skilled, low-paid work. Part of the problem with minority women activists seeking to kind of have their voices heard is that their policymakers kind of don't really recognize them as active agents and don't really recognize their claims, particularly those kinds of political claims they make to the state and to other citizens in relation to their race, their class, and their gender. And also, especially in this moment of the migration crisis, issues of legal status as well. So that's a huge problem of policymakers not recognizing those claims and certainly not recognizing intersectional claims. But there's another problem as well with women of color activists who interact with their white allies in social movements. So at the moment, in Europe, we're in this moment of economic crisis. And a lot of the social movements that have developed in response to the crisis are premised on socialist politics, anarchist politics, or populist politics. And unfortunately, in these spaces, what we see is there's very little spaces for maneuvering for women of color. So if they want to make claims to their white social movement allies that, based on kind of intersectional understandings of social justice, as I said, based on race, class, gender, and legal status, oftentimes they're silenced and essentially kind of hustled out of these spaces because because in order to exist and kind of flourish in these social movement spaces, what often seems to happen is they have to shut up about their race and shut up about their gender. And really the only kinds of political claims that are available in these spaces are class-based claims. So it's this tyranny and really the hegemony of class-based politics. But of course, as we know, when we look at the social and economic outcomes of women of color, class cannot possibly explain their unequal social positions. We have to have an understanding of race and class, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of space in policymaking processes or in social movements for that to happen. Britain and France are oftentimes constructed as opposites, so kind of opposite contexts because of their citizenship regimes, mostly around issues to do with the ideas of citizens making claims in public space. And so we see this most obviously in France with the domination of this idea of laïcité, this official state policy of secularism. And so what that means is it's very difficult for citizens, particularly women of color citizens, but also kind of folks with irregular legal status as well, to make race-based and to a certain degree gender-based claims to the state. Because in the French context, you are it's a very strange situation where you're just this kind of de-classed, de-gendered, de-raced being in public space. So that's a real difference. And that creates real problems for our women of color activists, because oftentimes what we've seen is that in order to be heard by the state in the French context, women of color either need to, again, shut up and talk about their claims only in terms of gender or class, and certainly not race, or they kind of can adopt this identity of a victim. And so it can only be heard through this idea of victimhood, of wanting to escape from the hijab, wanting to escape from the burkini, wanting to escape from patriarchal violence in their ethnic communities. But any other kinds of claims, cannot be heard in the French context. And so that's very different from what we see in Britain, especially in England and Scotland, where in the political science literature, we think of it as this kind of multicultural space where citizens can make claims to the state, can make claims based on race, class, gender. And we do see that, and that's reflected with our activists. But I suppose what's really interesting for us is that this is where, when you start from the position of the lived experiences of women of color, we see that these kind of national models, they start to break down. Because unsurprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, I don't know, but unsurprisingly, I guess, from my perspective, that actually women of color in both contexts deal with very similar, not identical, but similar issues. And that issue is the problem of audibility, of not being heard, not being taken seriously, because whether you're in so-called multicultural Britain or Republican France, what happens is that women of color are assumed to be kind of irrelevant, passive objects who are kind of forgotten about in policy making, and certainly not seen as at all relevant citizens whose voices need to be heard in public space.